Hi, everyone. Um, Thank you for joining us for another event with us at the Astoria Bookshop virtually. If you do not know who I am Christian. I'm one of the booksellers at the Astoria Bookshop here in Queens and the events coordinator. And I'm very happy to be introducing our author today. Daniel Nayeri is one of the I guess the debut authors is like the best, not a debut author, but a debut author of Levine Querido, which is a new publisher. And we're going to be talking about his brand new book, Everything Sad is Untrue, a True Story. So before we begin, I'm going to introduce him, and then we'll get into some questions about the book and other fun stuff. So Daniel Nayeri was born in Iran and spent a couple of years as a refugee before immigrating to Oklahoma at age 8 with his family. He is a publisher of Odd, an imprint at Macmillan, making him one of the youngest publishers in the industry. He has served on the Children's Book Council Diversity Committee and the Children's Book Council Panel Committee. And thank you for joining us, Daniel, today. This is kind of a full circle moment for me.
Yeah?
Yeah, because when I was 16, I attended one of your events for one of your earlier books, and you inspired me to write. So it's kind of like really awesome that I'm like introducing you today and like moderating your event for a new book. So
thank you. That's awesome.
Thank you for that.
Sure. You're 16. That's awesome. So you kept writing? Did you keep writing the project?
So I kept writing in high school, and then I kind of stopped because college happened. But now I'm writing. So like,
what kind of stuff do you write?
Mostly YA. I have other stuff planned, but mostly YA.
So you're gonna debut with a YA?
Yeah.
I like that. I think about that a lot in terms of publishing. Is like what's like the right place to debut? These are like silly things you ask yourself while you're sitting and you're publishing all day, and you're like, like, is it better to go YA and then go down, or go picture? The answer is it's both are fine, right? The answer is like, but you just start with where you want to start. What is it? Is it sort of contemporary stuff?
No, it's actually so I'm actually starting out with a paranormal horror book. Ooh. Which is very...
Tell me more.
Oh, God.
You didn't think I was going to do this. You didn't think I was going to turn the tables. I do jujitsu, son.
It is about two Latinx teens who live in Hudson Valley and have to take down a secret society that is a front for demons. And it kind of explores how whiteness is insidious towards Latinx individuals. But that's the
all right. The log line, I like it. I like that you had a log line in place. Like there's and it's a high concept idea. So like I used to talk about the difference between like high concept and low, or like soft concept, hard concept, right? Like something that's a little bit and really it was a log line conversation about how some stories you can really tell what it is just with that, so billionaire decides to open a park where he resurrects dinosaurs. Things go bad, right? And we all know what it is. But then sometimes you have like character studies, like the Gary Schmidt has these novels that are they're like character studies. They're brilliant and they're impossible to deliver a log line. They'll be like, so there's this 14-year-old and he's feeling upset, and then it's the 1960s and there's like birds. There's some birds involved. He really likes the theater. That's pretty cool. And his brother's kind of a jerk, but he goes off to Vietnam. He comes back. Anyway, I don't really know. It's just a bunch of really, really good writing. So that's cool. I like it.
Thank you.
When's it going on? Okay, we got to get you an agent by the end of this.
But I want to talk about your book. So it's fiction, historical, but also like kind of based on your life. So like, tell us about it a little. Like,
see, I was prepping. That whole thing was me prepping because I got a terrible log line. Can't sit, like, buckle up. It's gonna be a 20-minute log line. I liked yours better, but mine is so the story it's autobiographical, but it is a fiction. It's a novel, so it's an autobiographical novel about my family. It's about the sort of central arc of the story is about how I was born in Iran and my mother converted to Christianity. She was a devout Muslim, and when you convert, it it's capital crime. So she sort of ran afoul of the secret police, which in Iran is ominously named the Comité, which is the committee. The committee is not nearly as anodyne as it sounds. It's a fairly murderous group of human beings, and she ran, unfortunately, afoul of them. So we had to escape and became refugees. We went to the UAE and then a refugee camp on the outskirts of Rome, and then finally got asylum to Oklahoma, where the story begins, right? The main character, Khosrou, which is my real name, is standing in front of a classroom full of kids, and he's trying to tell them the story of, one, how that happened, that sort of that journey of how they ended up in Oklahoma, but also what life was like back then. Back then, he sort of had a really good life. It was sort of well-to-do, and in Oklahoma, they're extremely poor and on welfare and sort of on the wrong side of the tracks, so to speak. And back then, he sort of had a family, he had a father, and here in Oklahoma, he also has a stepfather, but not a particularly loving one. And so so everything is sort of dichotomous, and he's describing this to the kids, and the kids, frankly, don't believe him, right? They think he's making up all these stories. A lot of the stories seem like exotic. They sound like Aladdin. They definitely think that this sort of refugee kid is just trying to sound important and make stuff up. So he starts to feel a little bit like Scheherazade, right? Scheherazade is the great storyteller of Middle Eastern culture. She's the main character of the 1001 Nights, which is kind of more of an oral tradition, right? It's sort of these various stories that are ascribed to this sort of great woman who in the story is married to this murderous king who is going to listen to her tell this story in one night, and then will kill her in the morning. He has a habit of this. He marries a woman and then kills her in the morning. And so Scheherazade, being the sort of the hero that she is, tells a story so interesting and so tense, and ends it on such a climactic cliffhanger that every story in the Arabian Nights, it sort of ends with and as the sun rose, or as the sun came up, Scheherazade lapsed into silence, right? So she sort of ends every time the story in the middle, and the king has no choice but if he wants to hear the rest of the story, but to keep her alive. And of course, that's how she wins, right? He starts to feel this way too. He starts to sort of actually find a parallel in who he describes the classroom as his sort of skeptical audience, as his murderous critics. And so he starts to, that's sort of the theme of that starts to blend into his storytelling, and he starts kind of going further and further back into his family history, which is my family history, generations back to what I sort of describe as that place where family history starts to mingle with family mythology, legends, folklore, things that where the sort of historicity of it begins to become more and more doubtful. So that's the whole book. It's sort of he's in class each time trying to tell a story, and the structure is quite odd. It's kind of he's going back telling you the story of how they got there, but then going further back telling the story of or different myths and legends of Iranian culture. So that was the pitch. Is the elevator, did we get to your floor, or did I have to tackle you and keep you in the elevator for 20 more minutes?
To be fair, a lot of publishing houses have many floors, so I think it covers all the floors in the building. So
good floors. Famously, in the Flatiron building, they were still hydraulic elevators, like literally like water pumps in the basement, because it was such an ancient building. So if we were going to the top of the Flatiron, maybe I would have managed this.
But you kind of went into my next question. But before I do, if anybody watching has any questions and you are on social media, if you add us at astoriabookshop.com, we can take your questions that way, and we'll bring them up if we have time at the end. So speaking of like mentioning myths and like history, you weave a lot of like Persian myth and history and the narrative like very seamlessly, and like also including your own family history. like, how did you approach writing that? Because that does take a lot of like research, even though it is your own history. So you do have to like do some sort of research into it and like make it work for the book. So how did you do that?
Well, so yeah, the making it work is interesting. I find I'm a big believer in sort of just like, if you're taking it in, you start to kind of, the constellation starts to show itself in the sort of field of stars, but you have to sort of be taking a lot in. You have to be filtering a lot. So, which is sort of another way of just saying I ended up reading a lot of these stories in college, but also taking a lot of them in from my family. My dad is sort of a voice on the phone. He chose to stay in Iran when we escaped, and so he's always been a voice on the phone. And man, it's so hard to convey what that relationship is like, because I think it's not at all get on the phone and sit there and be like, yeah, so like I'll hear like, you know, friends or whatever talking to their parents, and they have a really interesting relationship. They'll like just describe their day. They'll sort of sit, and it's almost like sitting on the porch with each other and just kind of like, it wasn't like that at all. Like with my dad, partly because I was always afraid as a kid. I don't know if this was a real fear, but I was always very afraid that we were in Oklahoma because we were running away from the secret police, right? And so, and this isn't in the book, but I was always afraid that like they would listen in to our conversations, and then my dad would get in some kind of trouble, or they would listen in, and if I said something like, I went to the park, and that park was like Hafer Park in Edmond, Oklahoma, then like they'd show up, which I didn't put in the book because one, it's kind of like paranoiac, but two, I have no idea if that's true. Like, you know, I have zero. I was just swatting a fly, by the way, but I have no idea if that's true, but it's certainly something I thought. Like as a kid, I was very afraid of that. So we wouldn't sit there and talk about like what my day was like. And to be really honest, my days were, they were challenging, and I just didn't want to talk to them about it. So what we would end up talking about would be my dad sort of telling me stories of, you know, of his childhood, or stories of, you know, and he also had this anxiety, if I can speak for him, of me kind of forgetting my Iranianness, right? Like my language. Anytime I misspoke a Farsi word, Farsi is my first language. It's Persian, but you know, he would be really kind of upset by it. But I left when I was 6, so there are like, I couldn't write you a dissertation in Farsi. I can speak to you in Farsi and I can understand everything, but I don't have college level Farsi, right? Because I was a kid. And so he would really sort of be upset by that. And so he would always recite poems at me or talk to me about the Shahnameh, which is sort of the Persian national epic. And so a lot of these stories came to me that way. And how they lined up in the book, it was one massive filtering process. Like I have a big note section where I would think about how, like that's the story of the Kurds is a fascinating story, because in the Shahnameh, they're like described as half of the people. You know, there's a myth where the way should I tell you this myth? Am I spoiling? It doesn't matter. Spoiling. So there's this really great myth about the Kurds, right, in the Shahnameh, which is the Kurds are, of course, a nomadic people who travel in the hill countries between Iran and Iraq, and they don't have a country. Although, you know, when the British map makers were sort of partitioning the Middle East, it might have solved a lot of problems if they'd sort of delivered some of this. But I'm being sort of, so Kurdistan does not exist, but so as a result, they're sort of a nationless people, and interestingly, and this is in the book, this is true, or it's depicted because there's an older boy who's in the refugee camp with us, named Ali Shakari, who is like, he's from this people, and so you sort of see that he's also nationless, he's also a refugee, and my character sort of really looks up to him. But in the mythology of how the Kurds became nationless, it's not, well, the, you know, map makers or anything like that in modern nation state building. It was the myth that there was this evil king, and this evil king, sort of the devil, comes to him, and Shaitan comes to him and tricks him, and basically 2 snakes grow out of his shoulders. This is nuts. And every day these snakes want to eat the brains of two people, right? So two heroes pose themselves as chefs. I could not avoid that because I used to be a chef, so I gotta love hero chefs. Pose as chefs in his castle, and what they do is every day they take the two sort of sacrifices that are supposed to be to the king, and they take one of them and smuggle this he or she away, and they replace like a sheep's brain in there, right? And they feed it to this evil king, and there's a hero who destroys this evil king, and it's all great. But the described in this book is there's a moment where after months there are hundreds of people that they've saved, but and they give them sheep, they give them cattle, and they send them into the hills to be nomads, to live in the hills. And Ferdowsi says, and this is how the Kurdish people were created, and this is why they have no home. And interestingly, of course, like every day they only manage to save 1 out of 2. So they're half of a people, like, right? They're literally 1 of 2 every day. And Ali Shakari sort of talks about this. The way that these sort of lined up, these myths sort of, I wanted to hit that theme of being separated, being taken away from a family, being a part of a whole. When I would read something like that, a passage like that in the Shahnameh, I'd be like, oh my gosh, this is it. So it was a lot of sort of scavenger hunting. That was the short answer. It was a scavenger hunt. I should have said that.
But I mean, it was a great explanation of like how to get into a scavenger hunt, really.
Sure. Yeah.
So my next question, it kind of goes into the subjects and like themes you bring up in the book. So a lot of it is very much like very heavy issues and like very much like this could have easily been like an adult like book, in my opinion. Like the way it's written, it's very much like really engaging for an adult audience, but also it was written for a middle grade audience. So what made you write it for like a middle grade audience?
Yeah, so actually it's interesting. Like it'll in some like in Italy, I think it's getting published as an adult novel.
Wow, okay.
So you're right that I think in different places. I will say this: I began many years ago when I first started writing this. I did begin to write it as an adult novel. It's unrecognizable. If I showed you those pages, they're nothing like this. So I thought of it as well, but two things. One is when I sort of shifted into the POV of the younger kid. I think it opened up a lot of things. One of the main things that opened up is what I would consider like an emotional transparency, right? Like as a 12-year-old, it's really interesting. So as a 30-something, I've sort of processed a lot of this. I had a really chaotic childhood, you can imagine. And I've processed a lot of it. Like I've had the benefit of thinking about it. I've had the safety of being and the luck of having people who've helped me not to be burdened by these things, right? This is sort of just like the emotional work you do as an adult, as you sort of think about traumatic events and you work through them and work past them. So when I was writing it as an adult, it was actually fairly emotionally removed, right? When I shifted into the younger narrator, he was not past this stuff. He is very emotionally raw, and he is very transparent in how these things hurt him. I thought it was a much stronger piece sort of delivered from that perspective. But then you're absolutely right. I had to go through and make sure that it met the younger audience. You can have a young narrator and have it be an adult book. So then it became a question of audience and making sure that what's the right word? That look, I don't want a young audience to be burdened by that story in the same way that I was burdened by it when it happened. And novels can do that, right? Novels can take you to that moment of trauma and pretty effectively deliver that trauma. to a young audience, that I'm not sure I'm into. And I think people can disagree on that front, but I really wanted to make sure it was age appropriate and emotionally appropriate, like met them there.
Yeah.
There's a what friend of mine and a great author who also has a debut today. Her name is Vesper Stamper. I was talking to her on this topic. She said a line that I thought was so good. I will credit her, but I will also say it here. She said, I am incredibly aware that I'm speaking to other people's kids. And she's a parent and I'm a parent. And I was like, oh yeah, that's good. I get that feeling. I had that, I like to think I had that thought as well, though I did not express it so beautifully, that that how I would want an adult to tell that story to my child so that it is cathartic, it is elucidating, it is insightful, it is more importantly like helpful, it is useful to them. I wanted the narrative of Khosrou to be useful in the utilitarian sense, that for them to look at that and say, okay, I'm not a refugee from Iran with all these things in my life, but very clearly they have their own challenges, and for them to be able to take some piece of strength or utility from that book, that was the ultimate goal for the young reader. And because that was the North Star, that's sort of why I felt like, yes, this will work in the kids' world, and we'll go from there.
I think what I appreciated most about it was that a lot of, at least because I read a lot of middle grade for work and my own enjoyment, because middle grade's amazing, but sometimes you can kind of tell that authors are like kind of talking down to the intended audience. And I think when I was doing like my research into like just like reviews of the book and like from like Kirkus and everything, there was one that like stuck out to me, and I thought it was really like just like it kind of encapsulates what I thought of the book, which was like basically, and I wish I remember where it came from, but basically that you're challenging outright what young readers can handle and then like inform themselves from your the content that you bring forth, but it's your own experience, and like you're demanding a lot of readers from while they're reading it, because so much of it is traumatic to the character and to your own history, but they're getting so much back from it. So it's like they're acknowledging that like the reader might be also going through traumas, and they might be able to face it because of something like this, because of a book like this exists. And I think that's why it really resonated with me, because you're not treating like the audience like as children, even though they are. You're treating them as like a little human, and like they've also gone through their own experiences and traumas, and you're taking them seriously.
Well, yeah, thank you. That was critical. That would have been a fail state. Like I think about like what are the fail states for a book like this? And there's a lot of different ways to assess failure, right? I mean, it could just fail because nobody reads it, or it could fail because But the harshest fail state, I think, the one that would have broken my heart, I think, the most would have been, hey, like you used this book as therapy and it didn't help anybody else. That would be rough. And I think it's possible to do that when you're writing your own story. There's a lot of catharsis for the writer, but none for the reader. I call those books sort of ungenerous, right? It's like, why weren't you generous with me? Like, why didn't you left me here with this horrible thing? So I wanted very much hopefully not to fail at being generous. But the other thing you said is actually being duplicitous, right? Like being like, these things happened, but they didn't mean anything. like we just kind of like really we're like on a like, I don't know, in a fun house ride, and it's like,
that's a really good description of it, yeah.
And
like
I was like,
something like that.
Right. It's not a fun house, right? Like, we're not going to go past that, like, pirate holding a skull and not go, wait, did that guy just murder somebody and grab his skull? Like, that doesn't work. It doesn't work because kids, I agree with you. I think the majority of kids are just insulted by that sort of thing. those are the two guardrails, right? Don't be a fun house, but then definitely don't be ungenerously working out your own things in front of kids. Then make it an adult book. Make it whatever you want. But with kids, there has to be that other consideration, right? Of what am I doing here? Like, why am I speaking to a 12-year-old? And the answer is because, as Gary Schmidt says, the middle grade novel, the coming of age novel, is the moment a child turns his or her face to adulthood, right?
Yeah.
And that's the coming of age, right? Saying like, oh, that's what adulthood means. That is in and of itself a traumatic moment, right? Even if you've had the best childhood in the world, it's semi-traumatic to say, I'm never going to be a child again. This is over. That period of time is done. And we mourn that. You could mourn that if you've had the sweetest, nicest, but the fact is most people haven't. And the fact is, I would dare say nobody has, right? Like whatever we've got, we have our challenges. We have however we use broadly the term traumas. How do we equip a kid to actually be empowered by this idea, right? On my day side, I work on like what we call like truly useful books. Like when we say we want to empower a child, we're not saying that softly, like, oh yeah, we want to. So most people say empower a child and they mean encourage a child. Mm-hmm. I don't mean encourage a child. I mean more power than they used to have. Like before they read the book, they had a certain amount of agency. They had a certain amount of skills. After they read the book, they have one or more skills. What is that? Well, for Everything Sad is Untrue, I think it's that exactly. It's how do you process and engage with the infinite sadness of a world that is not as it ought to be? That's it. How do you engage with this? And that's all. That's a skill that if we deliver that to kids, it was age appropriate. It delivered. It was useful. It was generous. It was not withholding. To the extent that we did that, or I did that, to the extent that the book does that, it's sort of up for readers. But that was 100% the goal. And also the thing I'm most terrified of. You were speaking, and I was very clearly like clenching. I was like, oh my gosh, that's the fear. Like I hope that they're absolute that young reader is gaining that.
I think they will.
No, let's go for it. I'll take it. Thanks.
So speaking of like the very heavy themes that you bring up, there's a lot of like complex characters in the book, and like the sister and like the kids at the school are very like interesting to analyze, like thinking back on it now. But I really found it interesting, like Daniel's and his mother's relationship. And so like how did you approach writing like such complex characters in like a shortish like amount of a book? And also like why did you think it was important to like provide such like different and unique like characters within the novel?
Well, so I mean, to me there's a demarcation line between like for example, the two examples you gave, because a lot of the side characters are kind of like amalgams of people. It's a novel, it's fiction, so a lot of them are like mixtures of people. They're not real. There's not an ancillary person to it. That part, they're sort of they have to be there to make the structure work. So Mrs. Miller is like 5 of my teachers, and then also like a couple more I made up, and then like the kids in the class are they're kind of an amalgam. They're not really real. That said, my family, like those are very real people. Yeah. And even the side characters of my family, like my uncles and whatever, my grandparents. So that level, they I think end up being a little more complex. They end up being a little more real, if only because to me they're very real people. And and I have a very complex relationship with those people. And I have a very, I guess complex is the best way to put it. I want it to be, I want it to be as honest as humanly possible, or as honest as possible to me, but as also as even-handed as I could be. I don't think anyone gets a bad rap. Like even Ray, who is in a lot of ways, maybe the villain of the story, Raised My Stepfather, even he has a tragic sort of beginning as a young man. Like if you wanted, and I think one should, if you wanted to be a generous reader of Ray, who ended up causing a lot of havoc in my life, you can go back to his childhood, and it tells you the story of his childhood. It's the first time you see him, actually, right?
Yeah.
And he had a very, very difficult one. So, you know, to front that for even the villain is at the very least saying, this stuff does not come up out of nowhere. And I think even, you know, I think my sister, I have a very, you know, a complicated relationship with her, but, you know, in our childhood, we weren't like a team the way maybe I would have hoped. But in the end, and I won't spoil because it's the climax, she's heroic. And so I think the short answer to that question is I did not want to be unfair, despite the fact that I was also very emotionally fraught with some of these people, like my own father too. Like I think with all these people, like gosh, how do you speak about your own dad? And he chose to stay, which is tough. It's a tough one. I don't know if I would hope I wouldn't have made that choice. And at the same time, it's the choice that we live with. So I didn't give you a good answer, but also there's maybe not a good answer. There's not a good answer to how do you have a good depiction of complicated people who are also your family members.
This is actually secretly a psychology session. I mean, I think it is the honest answer, because I feel like there is very much like an easy way to get out of it. It's just like, oh, like, you know, they're just like real people, and like, you know, this is how I detect them. And you could have easily done it in a way where it's like, you could have painted them in any light that you wanted to and still somewhat had the same effect, but like you wanted to be honest with what both you experienced and also like what you wanted for the narrative. And that is very complicated, and that's an okay thing to have.
I mean, let me put it a different way to put it is like, there are definitely depictions of people in that book that I put in, despite the fact that that's not necessarily, like, if you were to say, Daniel, how do you feel about that person? I would say, I'd say they got off easy. Why? Because it was trying to be three-dimensional. It was trying to do them to the extent that I know people's perspectives. I tried to sort of deliver that part of it as well. But I mean, in that way, maybe the truest assessment of it would be, does Daniel agree with everything the book shows? And the answer is no. The answer is like, I am probably more, what's the way to put it? childish in my understanding of my own parents. I just am. Like, they're not really people. They're my parents. So that's how. But the book tries to make them people. The book tries to make them like divested of like what Daniel's, childish opinion is, or at least it tries. So who knows?
I mean, it's hard to, I guess, like reconcile like the image of your parents to like the reality of your parents, because they are your parents,
right?
And like that can be its own whole conversation.
That's true.
But the next one is a very serious question, so I hope you're prepared. You often talk about poop jokes in the book, which is honestly one of my favorite things about the book was the poop jokes. But you do it in a way that like you really kind of like, you talk about poop, but then also like pair it in a way and into a subject that is very like serious and like real. Like there's one instance of like you talking about, was it the sewage line? I'm like trying to remember reading, but like there was something about a sewage line, and then you talk about the smell of poop, and then like it's like, but that's actually not the strongest smell, like the worst smell. It's opium. And I was like, oh, like
Right.
That is really unexpected. So like why, like what made you like kind of do that? Because I've noticed it a few times throughout the book that it was very much like a switch.
Yeah.
And other than like, you know, kids love poop jokes.
Kids do love poop jokes. I find myself, so two books that I really affected me a lot in my sort of college days have to do with this. One is I sound like a hoity-toity person, but you know, one is Moby Dick, and the other is Midnight's Children. So Moby Dick, everybody knows there's the scene in the ambergris where these people are like going into these barrels of whale blubber, and they're trying to squeeze these like pustules of blubber and squeeze them and burst them, and it's kind of gross. But it's also one of the most important metaphorical scenes in the whole novel, right? I mean, people sort of are always like, oh yeah, it's full of like whaling information, and you go, no. Guys, Melville meant to do that. That was purposeful. I'm a big believer that those chapters are not to be skipped, and also are what inform the actual plot. It's bonkers to me that anybody would say like the whaling chapters are like some mistake that one of the greatest American novelists made. It's brilliant. And anyway, so there's that moment, just the idea of the physicality of that metaphor. And then in Midnight's Children, there's a scene that's really important where Salim Sinai is looking out of a window. I think he's on a train. I got to remember this better. But he's looking out a window, and he sees an old man. He's a sort of a homeless man, and he's literally like squatting down and pooping. And Salim is actually wistful at this, like, and you don't quite, in his description, you don't understand, is he wistful at this man's like freedom? Is he wistful at frankly, like the vigor of doing something like this? And and the old man looks at him and he laughs. He's very much like a, you know, like loony old homeless person. And he looks up and he says, I used to make them this big. And he's literally doing like a fishing story like this about like his like, I mean, his poop, like, which is gross, right? But is this perfect metaphor. Like throughout that book, there's this metaphor of like of pickling, and as a metaphor for like storytelling, layering flavors, but layering also like and pickling metaphors into each other and on top of each other. And he's himself like engaging in this by like pulling from all these different texts and making this like amalgam thing, and producing it. Like I could produce one, you know, and like what is the production of a person? And I understand that this is gross and maybe a little too abstract and maybe a little too undergrad-y, but when you think about it, like what do we produce as little animals, and then what do we produce as like angels, right? Like in our most animal form, all we produce is poop. In our most beautiful form, all we produce art. Right? Like these are not unrelated. I would make the case to you that poop is not just, it's not just in that book as a, tee-hee, let's make a fart joke, but rather the description of the range of what do people make in life. Do you live your life and abuse others and do nothing really in your short time on earth other than produce a whole lot of refuse? Or do you produce something more? Do you produce something beautiful? And do you make more out of this experience than the animalistic experience? Do you try to make something sublime? That was the metaphor in the book, and it's very, for what it's worth, like if you read it with that in mind, you see that Khosrou, the narrator, is trying desperately to not live in a world where he's surrounded by that. That's all. And in fact, when he comes to the United States, when he's not believed, like he's trying to produce a story, he's trying to produce this piece of art. And what is his first piece of his trouble? Right, is like he doesn't know how to use Western toilets. He's blocked. He's stopped. The poop is actually a metaphor. I know that sounds maybe silly. I'm definitely not. If I can trust me, I can show you the notes. It was very much a big part of it, and I really do. I think it was that passage in Midnight's Children that kind of got me thinking about that. That was maybe too much on poop, but that's what I got. And maybe I should have chosen pickles. If I had been like, I like midnight children, I should have just made pickles the metaphor. Why did I pick the poop guy? That part's my fault.
I mean, like, I think it did what it had to do, you know? Like, and clearly I enjoyed them because I really love a good poop joke, so.
Nice.
So shifting back to an actual serious question. So there's a strong relationship throughout the book with tied to food and memory. And I know that there's like a very straightforward answer to that, but I wanted to ask you anyway, why did you want to include that? And like specifically, like how did you approach tackling memories in association to food?
It's really funny you should say this. This is the same question as the question you just asked. It's the same part of the metaphor. And the easy answer, you're right, is like Proust did it. There's a great passage. I mean, it's the beginning passage of Swann's Way, you know, like Remembrance of Things Past, where he eats a Madeleine. Every author reads it. He eats a Madeleine cookie and he remembers his childhood in France and that particular cookie. And of course, neuroscientists have proven that, you know, your smells actually are stronger, but taste is quite strong also in like, you know, keeping memories. That wasn't actually the metaphor I was going for with this. It was part of the poop thing again. Why? Because there's actually a passage also where it describes different cuisines and their like tastiness to poop ratio, which I know it's like gross, but I
remember that.
But it's consumption and production. Like, right? Yeah. We think about like, what do you take in and what do you put out? What is the input and what is the output? If you have a life like my stepfather's, right, where he took in a lot of pain, well, he also put out a lot of pain. His input and his output were the same. What about a character like my grandfather? Quite the opposite. Takes it in and he becomes a farmer. There was a passage that isn't in the book where it describes, because I didn't know it, I was making it up, and so I took it out. But it was about how he planted his pain, and that's how his orchards came up, right? But he put it in the dirt. He did not put it on his kid. And so the question of food and memory is the same. Like when we take in our memories, people often take in an experience, and then we'll twist this memory, and its output. It is not art, is not beauty. It's a whole lot of poop. So yeah, I think what I was really trying to do was, again, show the metaphor of in life, you know, what we are given, you know, what we're the donné, what we're our lot in life, and what we end up doing with it. These were sort of the ins and the outs. So food and memory are sort of on this side, and sort of production, art, action. This is on this side, and you kind of see different characters metabolize these things very differently.
Yeah. Well, I think everything leads back to poop, I guess. That's what it seems like.
It's a rich metaphor.
So we actually do have a few questions in the comment section, so I'm going to pull some of them up.
Sure.
So Joanna asks, of all the memories you have of your childhood, what is your favorite one?
That's a good question. Of all my memories of my childhood, what is my favorite one? That one will stop you in your tracks. My favorite memory, my favorite memory of my. I'm thinking specifically back to the Iran era of my childhood. My favorite memory is a memory that I think about a lot. We had visited my grandfather in Aras, and it's a sort of this really beautiful place in central Iran where you're kind of going over this hill country, and then there's these just like sudden oasis of like, you know, this big sort of beautiful well, and a lot of a kind of pond, so to speak, but it's fed up from a well, so it's really clear water, and then there's orchards around, and it's not a lot of trees, but it's really beautiful. And there was a place where in the desert, basically, right, there was this man who was the storyteller of Aras, and we went and visited him with my father, and I remember sitting with my mom and my dad, and this man was sort of like, he was kind of like, he just loved kids, so he had built out of like scrap metal, he had built a Ferris wheel, like not a huge Ferris wheel, but like a Ferris wheel for the kids to sort of experience. So I remembered it as a really magical place. And he sat us down and he told this fairy tale that I had been looking for ages. Like all I remembered was there were 3 princes, and there was this cloud with a giant, and every night the giant would like in the cloud, a hand would come out and steal one of the. I didn't remember this part, but it was in my head. It was apples, but turns out later I did find it. By the way, it was golden apples. But and each of the princes tries to like stop the cloud, and the youngest one is like, keeps himself up by like cutting his finger and like, like dabbing it with lemon juice, so that all night he was sort of awake, and because all the first 2 brothers like fell asleep, and he then like shoots the giant in the cloud, and then follows the trail to like this well, and he goes down into the well where there's a magical world, and it's just this story that kind of like gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and it keeps going. And I didn't know if that man made that up or if it was a fairy tale or what. But all my life I've sort of like looked back and been like, that I wanted to be able to do that someday. So that's probably my favorite memory.
That's a really good memory to reflect on. Yeah. So the next question, I'm going to skip the next one to Joanna, has only to leave that for the end because it's a good ending question. So the next one is from Amanda. It says, "Hi, Daniel. I'm so excited to read your book. Can you talk a little bit about the title and what it means?"
Sure. So yeah, the title is "Everything Sad is Untrue," and it comes from a passage in Lord of the Rings where Sam and Frodo, they're despondent. It's one of the saddest moments in the book. And just in that sort of darkness, all of a sudden they hear the sound of laughter, and it sounds like, and they look up and they see that Gandalf, the old wizard who they thought was dead, he had sort of died protecting them, is alive. He's come back, right? And in his sort of very naive and childish sort of way, Samwise says, is it true, Gandalf? Like, is everything sad going to become untrue? And it's just so cute. He's such a like farm boy kind of character where he's like, I don't know what happens in the world. Like, is all the sadness going to be undone? But some great thing has happened, right? It's this really perfect moment because you're like, well, this thing did happen. It's miraculous that Gandalf came back to life. So why wouldn't everything sad come untrue? And so I loved that it was so hopeful. I love that it's truly naive and beautiful. But on its face, of course. And then there was the shift. It's "Everything Sad Will Become Untrue" was the title. But also, as I was reading the story, the narrator Khosrou is almost like he's a very presumptuous kid. He's a very blustery kid. He wants things to be true before they are. And so I said, well, I think the way Khosrou would have said it is "Everything sad is untrue." He just sort of accepts it and takes it on, and the future tense is now the present tense. Of course, on its face, it's also an untrue statement, right? Everything sad is not untrue. Sad things happen to us and all the time. So I liked that it was not on its face, like technically a true statement, but it is a statement that will become true. Like, I love that Khosrou is both right and wrong at the same time, which he's often in this book. He's right and wrong at the same time several times. So I like that as maybe the opener, and that's the title.
That's a really good reason to have that as a title. I didn't realize it was a Lord of the Rings reference either. He's a little nerd.
I read that book more than I read any other book as a kid.
Clearly, I have to brush up on my knowledge because I did not even catch that. But the next question comes from Thomas. So, your mother is a hero who made tremendous sacrifices for her faith. and her family. How does she describe her decision? How does she describe her decision and new life in America?
It's really funny. We just, by the way, did a video documentary about her. It's 10 minutes, and she kind of touches on this. She describes, well, I look, a great pain in the best world of all worlds. Both my mom and I think, have the same opinion, which is we would love nothing more than to see Iran again. She would love nothing more. Her family, so much of her family is there, so many people she knows. In a lot of ways, her heart is there. She, that's our home country. I would love it. I would love to be at a place where I actually went to LA once. So in Oklahoma, there aren't that many Farsi speakers. I went to LA once, and I was walking on the street, and I heard like people just speaking Farsi, and I could understand them. This was the language that was like secret in my family. Like I could go to a mall in Oklahoma and be like, or a party and be like, "Mom, I hate it here. Can we go home in Farsi?" And I could say that like to her out loud in the room, and it would be fine because we're the only people who speak it. You can't. And in LA, I went. It was unbelievable how meaningful it was to me to suddenly hear just to hear it. I can't imagine what it would be like to go back. And I know that my mom also feels that way. So that said, she'd make that trade all day, every day. Like it's the fact is this is her faith. It's and it was a sort of and I think that video ends with her saying, "I would do it all over again." And it was an extreme amount of hardship, but and she loves it here as well. I think one of the things the book tries to do is not make that dichotomy of old place good, new place bad. That's not true. If that was true, then why can't we go back, right? Like I think there's the great welcoming and open-armed nature of America, but also Oklahoma at that time meant that there were families there who made unbelievable sacrifices for us to visit. Jim and Dean Dawson, they've passed. There are a couple who literally co-signed for a single mom with 2 kids under the age of 10 to under the age of 12 to come, and they literally co-signed. Like co-signed and sponsoring is a really, really big deal, right? It means that if we had sort of fallen on hard times or defaulted on things, like they would be financially responsible for us. It's like it's putting yourself out on a limb. They didn't even know us. Why would you do that? Like, why would you ever behave with such generosity to a random family of refugees who, by the way, we then stayed in their home for, I think 6 weeks. I gotta get that number right. It was. It was an amount of time that is fairly long, but sort of on the shorter side in the grand scheme of things. Before we sort of got on our feet and found an apartment and things like that. So I don't remember the exact number, but you really, how many people do you know that would do that and open their doors to strangers just showing up? I don't know that many, but I know they have them in Oklahoma. That's for sure. And they have them in the United States, and I know we have. It's a very, that was 30 years ago, but I was very thankful that those people existed, and I still am, and so is she. So New Life in America is not. It's not just us sitting down thinking, "Gosh, I wish we could go back to Iran." You really are of two hearts here. America was very welcoming, and it was a refuge. But gosh, it'd be nice to see family again too, right? Like you can say both, you can hold both in your hands.
That reminds me that didn't you do something similar before times where it's like you were inviting people to your home for dinner?
I'm gonna go back to that. It was called Welcome Everybody. Yeah. I would post up on Mondays. I would post an invite on my social, and literally anybody could sign up and come to my house for dinner that Saturday night. We don't have a big place in New Jersey, so it's on Jersey City. So it was usually about 4 to 6 people, but wow, it was so neat. Just random folks come and we make dinner for them. It was a 3-course meal. I used to cook a lot. I love cooking, so I'm gonna go back to that someday. God, hopefully, God willing, that won't be weird. If someday they can eat food together. Can we do that someday? I hope so. That would be good.
So it's the next question is from Antonio. I want to hear more about your grandpa.
Oh man, so do I. I was talking to my dad a couple days ago, and he he said he did this very Persian thing. Like he was very clearly trying. There's a moment in the myths. It's a very Persian moment. In fact, in the book, I say it's really Persian, where the son is like pouring out his heart, and the dad and pouring out his heart about how like the dad's like crimes against him, and the dad's response is, "It's good that you can express yourself," which is such a like. What you didn't? I was talking to my dad about how I started writing this book because the day he called me and told me my grandfather had died, and I realized that the ending for this book, what I always wanted, was I wanted to begin with the scene of me the first time going to my grandfather's home, and that's the only memory I have of him. And I wanted the book to end, this was when I thought it was an adult book, as a 30-something getting to go back to Iran, getting to see the house again, see my grandfather again. Like, what would that was the bookend. And it was such a perfect writerly bookend. And then when he called and said he died, I was like, oh, I assumed I would have memories in the future. I assumed I would have more experiences, but it was cut right then. And so and hence now the book begins with him sort of counting the memories. That was something I did in my 30s as well. I did it as a kid too, but with that sort of obsession of, oh, I don't get to have that ending. So anyway, I was talking to my dad a week ago, and I was telling him that like that's in the book, and he goes, Daniel, I spoke to Baba Haji, like I spoke to him, and I would tell him, because he knew I felt this guilt that I never gave my grandfather my visit back, right? I never could. And so he goes, Daniel, don't worry. He goes, I told Baba Haji that you want to come back someday and see him. And before he died, he said, Agistan will always be here for him. And I was like, well, no, I don't actually, I care, but I don't care that the trees are there. Like I'm not given solace by the fact that his farm will always be there for me. And I was like, oh, it's such a perfect Iranian grandpa thing. Is like he didn't realize that the thing I want to come back to see him. I want to come back and hear his voice, but he gave me the solace that the trees will always be there. So that's the best I got on my grandpa. I wish I also wish I could hear more.
Yeah, I mean it's really hard to lose someone, especially before you actually get to do the things you want to do with them.
Yeah.
But on a happier note, which part of the book did you enjoy writing the most?
Oh my! I loved writing the phone calls with my dad. I loved. There's a sequence I really like where the character talks about, would you rather a God who speaks or a God who listens? And I wanted that in there because, one, it's a question. The kid's constantly asking himself questions that are like massive. How do you deal with this kind of pain? Or like, what do you do when you're counting the memories? Or at one point he asked that question that sort of like people ask all the time. Is like, can God make something so big that he can't himself lift? Right? It's a paradox. Like if he could, then he would be weak. But if he couldn't, then he wouldn't be God. And so he's asking this question of like, would you rather a God who speaks or a God who listens? I got interviewed just yesterday by a young lady. She was like 10 for Time magazine for kids. And I was amazed. First of all, she was 10 and she was a really good reader. And shout out to Abby. And she said, like, what do you want young kids to learn? And I was like, wow, that's a really good question. I don't know what I want them to learn, but I do want them to ask that question of like, what is the thing that, like my mother, you would give up everything for? Like, what is that? What is that number one thing? I'm speaking to this 10-year-old. I'm saying, like, obviously you love your family and you love eating cookies and you love getting good grades, and those are all different levels of priority. Something tells me your family is probably more of a priority than your eating cookies, but there's something at number one, right? That's the nature of a list. What's number one? I think you cannot be too young to ask yourself that question. And that's the God that speaks into your life. That's the God that you speak to. And so that's my favorite passage in the book.
Yeah, I can't even like that was a really good passage. Like well, yeah.
Well, he also says at one point, he goes, a God who speaks is the law, right? Like, because gods who speak, right? Like we're talking about like, it has been spoken. Here are the 10 commandments. It's written in stone. Or like the God who speaks is the law. The God who listens is love, right? The God who listens is sitting there like a parent, and you can go pray to them, whatever religion this may be. So the God who speaks is justice. The God who listens is mercy. Which is it? Do you want justice or love? Do you want mercy or righteousness? And the answer is, of course, you have to have both. We're living actually in a culture where we think about this all the time: justice or mercy, love or law. And the answer is love without the law, like love without justice, is self-serving. There's no such thing as love without justice is self-serving. Justice without love is cruelty. It's horrifying. You can't actually have a beautiful society without both at the same time. That to me was like, I was like, ooh, I like that. So also, yeah. So that was my favorite part. I answered that question twice with 2 different passages. So obviously I'm just, it was one big section.
Yeah. I mean, you could answer however you like, honestly. It can change.
No wrong answer.
So finally, what are you working on next?
Oh man. I woke up a couple nights ago. The reason that question about my memory and the dude, the Ferris wheel in the desert, I woke up a couple nights ago thinking I should write that as a picture book. But did you ever read, was it Polaco who, When I Was Young in the Mountains? I got to Google that right now because I can't. It's not Polaco. When I Was Young in the Mountains. Who's it by? Oh, Rylant, Cynthia Rylant. Man, Polaco and Rylant were like, they were killers back in the day. Anyway, Cynthia Rylant wrote a really beautiful picture book called When I Was Young in the Mountains, and I would love to think, but that's literally what I dreamed about last night, so that can't be it. What I'm working on now is a middle grade novel set in the 11th century Silk Road. And have you ever seen The Music Man? The musical. It's kind of, I joke that
I've heard of it. I haven't seen it.
Okay. So it's The Music Man is this dude who goes from town to town in like America, like swindling people. And I joke that it's kind of like The Music Man set on the Silk Road. He is this guy who sort of goes from village to village swindling people. And this young boy who is a Zoroastrian monk, ex-Zoroastrian monk, who sort of ends up traveling with him, and they find out that all these villages that he's been swindling have gotten really, really mad, and they've each hired a different assassin to come and kill him. So it becomes kind of like a buddy comedy where they are like racing across the Silk Road to avoid all these different assassins. We'll see how it goes. It's an odd mixture, but that's what I've been thinking about.
Well, Lexi says that she loves The Music Man so much, Daniel.
Really? if you want a portly huckster, I'm your guy. Like portly hucksters are like Daniel's métier. He's a Sogdian, which is like Proto-Persians, and I describe him as the Music Man. And do you remember the dude at the beginning of Aladdin who's like trying to sell you stuff? He's Robin Williams.
Yes.
That like he's like this like really what is the word? He's like this like salesman type. This character is a merger of those two. For kids.
Yeah, for kids. But yeah, I mean, we're out of time, I guess. I realized just now. But thank you so much for doing this, Daniel. Like, I really learned so much, and I'm sure everyone who's been watching has also. Before everyone leaves, I just want to remind you that you can get Everything Sad is Untrue a true story from us at the Story of Bookshop if you go to our website. And congratulations on a new book, and congratulations to Levine Querido to their launch.
Yes, thank you.
I'm really excited to see what is in store for them and for you.
Same here. Thank you so much. It's like one big party. It's so fun to be a part of the Levine Querido list, if only because everybody's jazzed about all of it. so cool. So thanks again. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Have a good night, everyone.